January 17, 1945. Somewhere in the frozen fields of eastern Pennsylvania, the military convoy slows to a halt outside a sprawling industrial complex that stretches farther than the eye can comprehend. Steam rises from 1,000 vents, curling into the winter sky like the breath of some vast mechanical beast. The hum is what strikes first, not loud but constant, omnipresent, a low vibration that seems to emanate from the earth itself. Oberst Friedrich Müller steps from the transport truck, his boots crunching on gravel dusted with coal soot. He is 43 years old, a veteran of the Great War, a man who once commanded a panzer regiment across the steppes of Russia. Now he wears no insignia of rank, only the coarse gray uniform of a prisoner of war. Beside him, a dozen other German officers emerge, blinking against the pale morning light. They have been told nothing except that they are to observe. What they observe, they cannot yet imagine. The factory before them is the Ford River Rouge Complex in Dearborn, Michigan, though Müller does not know this yet. He knows only that the building seems to have no end, that its smokestacks rise like cathedral spires, that the sound of hammering metal echoes across the frozen landscape like artillery fire. An American lieutenant, young and clean-shaven, gestures them forward. "Gentlemen," he says in accented German, "welcome to the American industrial machine." There is no irony in his voice, no mockery, only a quiet certainty, as if he is inviting them to witness a natural law. Inside, the scale defies comprehension. The main assembly hall extends for nearly a mile, its ceiling lost in the haze of welding sparks and industrial smoke. Conveyor belts move in synchronized rhythm, carrying half-formed automobiles. No, not automobiles, Müller realizes with a jolt. Truck chassis, military trucks, B-24 Liberator engine components. The same conveyors that once produced family sedans now birth the instruments of war, and they do so with a speed that seems almost supernatural. A completed truck rolls off the line every 94 seconds. Müller watches one emerge, complete from frame to wheels, painted olive drab, ready for Europe. 94 seconds. He thinks of the Opel factory in Brandenburg, where his brother worked before the war, where a single truck might take 3 days to assemble, where shortages of rubber and steel had reduced production to a trickle by 1943. Here, there are no shortages. Here, abundance is the default state of existence. The historical moment that brings Friedrich Müller and his fellow officers to this place is born from a deliberate American strategy that emerged in late 1944. The United States War Department, in coordination with the Office of War Information, had developed what they termed Industrial Re-Education Tour for high-ranking Axis prisoners of war. The logic was elegant in its psychological precision. German and Japanese officers had been raised on propaganda that depicted the United States as a decadent, weakened nation, corrupted by democracy and ethnic diversity, incapable of martial discipline or industrial coordination. The Führer himself had dismissed American production capacity as Jewish exaggeration. Joseph Goebbels had declared in a 1942 radio address that the Americans cannot build a proper tank, let alone an army. These tours were designed not as punishment, but as revelation. Show them the truth, the reasoning went, and the truth would do more to break the myth of Axis superiority than any battlefield defeat. By January 1945, the war in Europe had already turned decisively. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last great gamble in the West, had collapsed under the weight of American reinforcements and firepower. Soviet armies were grinding toward Berlin from the east. Yet for the German officers now standing in the River Rouge complex, the war had been an abstraction since their capture, some at Normandy, others in the Ardennes, one pulled from the rubble of a destroyed command post in the Huichin forest. They had expected prison camps, interrogations, perhaps summary execution. Instead, they had been transported across the Atlantic, fed 3 meals a day, more food than most German civilians had seen in 2 years, and now stood witness to this. Müller had expected many things from America. He had expected a nation of farmers and shopkeepers playing at war, propped up by British desperation and Russian barbarism. He had expected chaos, the natural result of a mongrel society without racial purity or central authority. He had expected, perhaps, to see the strain of total war etched into the faces of workers, the same hunger and exhaustion that had become universal in the Reich. What he did not expect was this: a factory floor where men of every conceivable background, white, Negro, women in coveralls with their hair tied back, worked in seamless coordination, where the assembly line moved with the precision of a Beethoven symphony, where not a single face bore the gaunt desperation he had come to associate with wartime production. The workers do not look starved. They do not look afraid. They look improbably focused. Some even appear to be smiling. An American engineer, a man in his 50s with grease-stained hands and a Michigan accent, approaches the group. He does not salute. Americans, Müller has learned, are strangely informal with military courtesy. "This line here," the engineer says, tapping a clipboard against a massive stamping press, "produces 500 tank hulls per week. That's just this building. We got 4 more like it in the complex. 500. Müller does the arithmetic in his head. 26,000 tank hulls per year from this single facility. He remembers intelligence briefings from 1943 estimating total American tank production at perhaps 3,000 units annually. The intelligence had been wrong, catastrophically wrong. The symbolic object that begins to dominate Müller's perception is not a weapon, not a vehicle, but something far more mundane: the lunchbox. He notices them everywhere: metal pails with handles, stacked on shelves beside workstations, open during brief breaks. Workers reach into them and extract sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, thermoses of coffee, apples, sometimes even slices of pie. The abundance is staggering. Müller has not seen a piece of fresh fruit in 8 months. The last time he ate meat that was not reconstituted from God knows what was November 1944, a week before his capture. Yet here, on this factory floor, in the midst of total global war, common laborers eat as if scarcity does not exist. One worker, a Negro man with powerful forearms, catches Müller staring. He holds up half a sandwich, thick slices of ham between white bread, lettuce and tomato visible, and nods, almost apologetically. Müller looks away. The tour continues through the complex with relentless, crushing thoroughness. They are shown the steel mill that produces its own alloys from raw ore delivered by Great Lakes freighters. They witness the glass plant manufacturing windshields at a rate of 4 per minute. They stand before the tire facility where synthetic rubber, developed to counter axis control of Southeast Asian plantations, is molded into treads that will carry trucks across North Africa, Italy, France, and soon into Germany itself. At each station, the American guides provide statistics, production rates, tonnage, worker efficiency metrics. The numbers cease to register as individual data points and become instead a single, overwhelming truth. This is not a nation at the breaking point. This is a nation that has barely begun to exert itself. Major Hans Dietrich, standing beside Müller, had commanded a Tiger tank battalion in Normandy. He is a veteran of Kursk, a recipient of the Knight's Cross, a man who once believed German engineering represented the apex of military technology. He stares at an assembly line producing radial engines for B-24 bombers and speaks quietly, almost to himself. "We were building 12 Panthers per week at the Henschel plant in Kassel. 12. They told us it was a triumph of production." He gestures at the engine line. "How many of these?" The American lieutenant consults his notes. "This facility completes 64 engines per day. 192 if you count the 2 other engine plants in the Detroit area." Dietrich says nothing more. His face has gone the color of ash. The historical record supports every figure the Americans present, though the German officers cannot yet verify this. United States industrial output in 1944 reached levels unprecedented in human history. American factories produced 96,318 aircraft that year, more than Germany and Japan combined. Tank and self-propelled gun production exceeded 29,000 units. The shipyards launched a merchant vessel every 8 hours, a destroyer every week, an aircraft carrier every month. This was accomplished not through slave labor or forced drafts, but through a combination of factors that the Nazi economic model could never replicate: voluntary mobilization, technological innovation, decentralized production, and above all, an economic base that had never been subjected to strategic bombing. While the Reich struggled to maintain output from underground factories and dispersed workshops, American production lines operated in broad daylight, unmolested, expanding with each quarter. As the morning wears into afternoon, the officers are taken to the canteen facility. It is a vast hall with long tables and serving lines, and the smell nearly buckles Müller's knees. Roasted meat, fresh bread, vegetables that have not been pickled or preserved beyond recognition. The American lieutenant explains that this is the workers' lunch facility, operating in 3 shifts to feed round-the-clock production. They get hot meals twice per shift, he says. Company subsidizes it, keeps productivity high. Müller watches a line of workers file through, loading their trays with portions that would constitute a feast in Germany. A young woman, perhaps 20, takes a piece of chicken, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans, a roll, and a slice of chocolate cake. She pays with a few coins and sits down to eat, chatting with coworkers. She does not hoard the food. She does not eat with the desperate speed of the starving. She eats normally, casually, as if this abundance is permanent and guaranteed. The emotional contrast crystallizes in this moment. Müller had expected to find an enemy weakened by war, strained by the demands of global combat, vulnerable in the way that Germany had become vulnerable: rationing, shortages, civilian suffering. Instead, he has discovered an enemy that grows stronger from conflict, that translates war into jobs and prosperity, that feeds its factory workers chocolate cake, while German children subsist on turnips and potato peels. The cognitive dissonance is profound. Everything he was taught about the inherent weakness of democratic capitalism, about the inevitable superiority of centralized fascist organization, has been revealed as fiction, not mistaken, not propaganda spun from partial truth. Fiction, a lie constructed to mask the Reich's fundamental inadequacy. The tour's final stop is perhaps the most devastating. They are taken to a parking lot, not a storage depot, but a simple parking lot for workers' personal vehicles. Rows upon rows of automobiles stretch across several acres. The American lieutenant stops the group and lets them look. "These belong to the people you just saw on the factory floor," he says. "Machinists, welders, assembly workers. They drive to work." Müller counts the cars in the nearest row. 30. 40. He stops counting. In Germany, automobile ownership had been the province of the wealthy and the party elite. The Volkswagen, the people's car, had been a propaganda promise never fulfilled for the average worker. Yet here in America, common laborers own vehicles. They park them casually without guards, apparently unconcerned about theft. The implications are staggering. This is not merely industrial capacity. This is systemic, pervasive wealth operating at a level the Reich never approached, even in peacetime. Captain Werner Schroeder, formerly of the Luftwaffe, breaks the silence. How many factories like this exist? The American considers the question. Automobile plants converted to war production, dozens. Major ones like this, maybe 15, 20. Then you got the dedicated military manufacturers, the aircraft plants, the shipyards. He pauses, perhaps recognizing the impact of his words. We got a lot of space here, a lot of resources, a lot of people who want to work. Schroeder nods slowly. He had been shot down over France in June 1944, flying a Focke-Wulf 190 against waves of American bombers. He had cursed their numbers, the endless formations that darkened the sky day after day. He understands now where those bombers came from. Not from some Herculean effort that would inevitably exhaust itself, but from factories that could produce war material as easily as they once produced consumer goods, from an economy so vast that total war was merely an adjustment of output, not a redefinition of existence. The transformation occurring within these men is not immediate conversion, not a sudden embrace of American ideology. It is something more fundamental and more painful, the collapse of a worldview. They had been soldiers of the Reich, believers in the Thousand-Year Reich, adherents to a philosophy that promised German dominance through racial superiority and martial discipline. Some, perhaps, had joined the party out of conviction. Others had simply served their nation as soldiers do, without deep political commitment. But all had operated under the assumption that Germany represented the apex of European civilization, that the Reich's industrial might and military prowess would inevitably triumph over the decadent democracies of the West. This assumption had not been a matter of propaganda. It had been the water in which they swam, the unquestioned foundation of their understanding of the world. Now, standing in an American factory that produces more in a day than German industry could manage in a month, that foundation crumbles. The historical evidence of this psychological transformation appears in numerous sources, though Müller's story is representative rather than singular. Reports filed by the War Department's Provost Marshal General's office detail the effects of these industrial tour on Axis prisoners. In one documented case, a German colonel who had been shown the Willow Run bomber plant in Michigan, where B-24 Liberators were produced at a rate of 1 per hour, requested permission to write a report for distribution to other German POWs, detailing what he had witnessed and the Japanese officers subjected to similar tour experienced parallel revelations, though filtered through different cultural assumptions. Whereas German ideology had emphasized racial superiority and martial spirit, Japanese military culture had stressed Bushido, the way of the warrior, and the unique spiritual essence of the Japanese people. Neither framework prepared them for American industrial capacity. A particularly well-documented case involves Commander Toshio Hashimoto of the Imperial Japanese Navy, captured after the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Shown the Kaiser shipyards in Richmond, California, where Liberty ships were launched after an average construction time of 45 days, Hashimoto initially refused to believe the figures. "Impossible," he stated through an interpreter. "A ship requires a year to build properly." The American guide simply pointed to the launching ways, where a newly completed vessel was sliding into San Francisco Bay, while another keel was already being laid in the vacated slip. Hashimoto watched in silence. In his later writings, produced decades after the war, he described that moment as the death of his belief in Japanese inevitable victory. "We were told American shipbuilding was slow and inefficient," he wrote. "We were told wrong." As the day concludes and the German officers are loaded back onto transport trucks, Müller clutches a small object in his pocket, a simple steel washer, picked up from the factory floor when no one was watching. It is perfectly machined, smooth and precise, stamped with microscopic lettering. Ford 1944. It is a trivial thing, a component worth fractions of a cent, probably swept up and discarded by the thousands in routine cleaning. Yet to Müller it has become a talisman, a physical proof of what he has witnessed. He cannot take photographs. He cannot remove documents. But he can keep this small circle of steel, this tiny product of the machine that has rendered his nation's defeat inevitable. The return journey to the POW camp is conducted in near silence. No one speaks of what they have seen, yet everyone is processing it. The bus passes through American towns, small communities with churches and schools, houses with front porches, commercial streets with shop windows displaying goods. Children play in yards. Women push strollers. Cars drive past bearing families on afternoon errands. This, too, is part of the revelation. The war that has consumed Europe utterly, that has reduced German cities to rubble and German civilians to scavengers, has barely touched American daily life. The factories run at full capacity, but the schools remain open. The soldiers deploy overseas, but the shops remain stocked. It is war without suffering, abundance without sacrifice, or at least so it appears from the window of a prisoner transport. The truth is more complex, of course. American families grieve their dead, rationing exists, sacrifice is real, but the scale is different, the impact cushioned by sheer economic magnitude. America can wage total war and still maintain civilian prosperity. Germany cannot. That is the asymmetry that decides everything. In the following weeks, Müller writes letters to his wife in Stuttgart, carefully worded to pass camp censors. He does not describe the factory directly, such details would be redacted. Instead, he writes about abundance. The food here is plentiful, he tells her. The guards eat the same meals as we do from the same kitchens. They do not seem to consider this remarkable. He writes about waste. I saw a worker discard half a sandwich because he was full. Half a sandwich, Elizabeth, white bread and meat. He threw it away as if it meant nothing. He writes most tellingly about the future. When this is over, when we are permitted to return home, we will need to rebuild everything. Not just the buildings, but the ideas. We were told things that were not true. I think you know what I mean. I think many people will need to reconsider what they believed. These letters, preserved in the National Archives, are among thousands that tell similar stories. The POW camps in the United States became sites of informal re-education, not through coercion but through exposure. German prisoners worked on American farms and witnessed agricultural mechanization that made German methods appear medieval. They worked in labor details alongside American civilians and learned that the multi-ethnic society they had been taught to despise functioned with remarkable efficiency. They attended camp cinemas and watched Hollywood films that depicted a society confident and prosperous. Some resisted these impressions, clinging to Nazi ideology out of conviction or stubbornness. But many, perhaps most, underwent a quiet transformation. They did not become Democrats overnight, but they stopped being true believers in the Reich. The symbolism of the lunchbox, that mundane container of daily sustenance, haunts Müller's thoughts in the months that follow. He dreams of it sometimes, those metal pails lined up by the hundreds on factory shelves, each one packed with food that would constitute luxury in Germany. The lunchbox becomes, in his mind, the perfect emblem of the difference between systems. In Germany, the state had promised greatness and delivered hunger. In America, the state had guaranteed freedom and delivered abundance. The connection between these outcomes and the underlying political structures became impossible to ignore. Democracy had not weakened America. It had unleashed productive capacity that authoritarianism could never match. The free market had not created chaos. It had coordinated industrial output on a scale that central planning could only dream of achieving. These were uncomfortable truths for a man who had sworn an oath to the Führer, who had believed in the mission of the Reich. But they were truths nonetheless. Historical analysis of American industrial dominance during World War II identifies several key factors that enabled the overwhelming production capacity witnessed by Müller and his fellow prisoners. First, geographical immunity from attack meant that American factories operated without the disruption of strategic bombing or the need for costly dispersal and fortification. Second, access to vast natural resources, oil from Texas, iron ore from Minnesota, coal from Pennsylvania, eliminated the resource constraints that crippled Axis production. Third, a large, educated, and motivated workforce, augmented by women entering industrial employment in unprecedented numbers, provided the labor necessary for massive output. Fourth, standardization and mass production techniques, pioneered by American automobile manufacturers, translated seamlessly to military production. Finally, a flexible economic system that could rapidly reallocate resources from consumer goods to war material proved far more effective than the rigid, ideologically driven planning of the Axis powers. The German economic model, by contrast, suffered from fatal contradictions. Hitler's regime had come to power promising to restore German prosperity and military power, but it pursued policies that undermined both goals. Rearmament in the 1930s had been conducted in secret, limiting economies of scale. Autarky, economic self-sufficiency, had been pursued even when it resulted in inefficiency and waste. Conquered territories had been ruthlessly exploited rather than integrated into a functioning economic system. Slave labor, employed extensively in German war production by 1944, proved far less productive than free workers with a stake in their output. Most fundamentally, the Nazi obsession with racial ideology led to the persecution and murder of millions who could have contributed to the economy, including skilled workers, scientists, and engineers. When Müller stood in that American factory and saw workers of different races collaborating efficiently, he was witnessing the practical superiority of inclusive pragmatism over exclusionary ideology. By the spring of 1945, as news of Germany's collapse filtered into the POW camp, Müller's transformation was complete. He did not suddenly love America or renounce his German identity, but he understood, with bitter clarity, that the war had been lost not on the battlefield but in the factory. The bravery of German soldiers, the tactical brilliance of German commanders, the technological sophistication of German weapons, none of it mattered against an enemy that could produce 50 tanks for every one the Reich built, that could replace destroyed aircraft faster than pilots could be trained to fly them, that could feed its armies fresh rations, while German troops subsisted on black bread and horse meat. Courage could not overcome mathematics. Ideology could not defy industrial capacity. The war had been decided on assembly lines in Detroit and Pittsburgh, and Los Angeles, decided by workers with lunchboxes and parking lots full of personal automobiles, decided by a system that turned abundance into armor and prosperity into power. The epilogue to this story unfolds over decades, not days. Friedrich Müller returned to Germany in 1947, part of the massive repatriation of POWs in the war's aftermath. He found Stuttgart in ruins, his home destroyed by Allied bombing, his wife living in a refugee shelter. His brother, who had worked in the Opel factory, had died in 1944 when British bombers struck the plant. The Germany Müller returned to bore no resemblance to the Reich he had served. It was occupied, divided, humiliated. Yet within this devastation, seeds of renewal were already sprouting. The Marshall Plan poured American aid into reconstruction. Democratic institutions were being built, literally and figuratively, on the rubble of dictatorship. And Germans, confronted with the undeniable evidence of Nazism's crimes and failures, began the long, painful process of reckoning. Müller kept the steel washer from the Ford plant for the rest of his life. He carried it through the chaos of repatriation, through the hard years of rebuilding, through the German economic miracle that transformed the defeated nation into an industrial powerhouse once more, this time without the poison of fascism. In old age, living in a comfortable apartment in a rebuilt Stuttgart, he would sometimes take it from a drawer and turn it over in his fingers, remembering that January day in 1945 when the scales fell from his eyes. He gave it to his grandson in 1983, a few months before his death, along with an explanation of what it represented. "This," he told the young man, "is from the factory that built the machines that defeated Germany. But more than that, it is from the system that defeated us. Remember that power comes not from ideology or propaganda, but from feeding your people, from giving them reason to work and build, from trusting them to be free. We forgot that. America did not. The washer now resides in a small museum in Stuttgart dedicated to the city's history. It sits in a display case alongside other artifacts of the post-war era, labeled simply, Steel Washer, Ford Motor Company, 1944, brought to Germany by POW Friedrich Müller. Visitors pass it without much notice, their attention drawn to more dramatic exhibits. Yet for those who know its story, that small circle of precisely machined steel represents a moment of transformation, an instant when ideology collided with reality and shattered. It is a memorial not to American triumphalism, but to a harder truth, that systems which honor human dignity and freedom ultimately prove more powerful than those built on coercion and myth. That abundance is not weakness but strength. That democracy, for all its messiness and contradictions, unleashes human potential in ways authoritarianism never can. The lunchboxes are long since discarded, rusted away in landfills or recycled into new metal. The factory workers from that day in 1945 have passed into history, their contributions to victory fading from living memory. The River Rouge Complex still stands, though much reduced from its wartime glory, a relic of an industrial age giving way to new economic realities. Yet the lesson remains, preserved not just in museums and archives, but in the structure of the world the war created. The Axis powers sought domination and found ruin. The Allied powers, for all their flaws and contradictions, offered a vision of freedom backed by industrial might, and that combination proved decisive. German officers came to American factories expecting to see weakness. They found instead a mirror reflecting their own nation's failures, a glimpse of the terrible truth that they had served a system designed for collapse, that their sacrifices had been in service to a lie. This knowledge did not make their suffering less real or their losses less painful, but it meant that something could be built from the ruins, something better than what had been destroyed. The American factory worker who held up that sandwich to Müller, that small gesture of shared humanity across the divide of war, probably never knew the impact of his action. He returned home that evening, ate dinner with his family, perhaps listened to the radio or read the newspaper. His lunchbox sat on the counter, ready to be packed again the next morning. For him, abundance was normal. The miracle of American production was simply his daily life, unremarkable and assumed. Yet in that very ordinariness lay the deepest challenge to everything the Reich represented. Nazi ideology promised glory but delivered starvation. American democracy promised nothing more than opportunity and delivered enough for workers to throw away half a sandwich without a second thought. In the end, the war was decided not by speeches or symbols, but by this. One system fed its people and the other did not. One system trusted its citizens and the other did not. One system built factories that could illuminate a winter morning with the glow of endless production, while the other built camps that illuminated the night with the fires of its own immolation. This is what Friedrich Müller understood on that January day in 1945, standing in an American factory with the hum of machinery in his ears and the smell of industrial production in his nostrils. This is what the steel washer represented, what the lunchboxes symbolized, what the endless assembly lines proved beyond doubt. The war was over long before the formal surrender. It had been over since the moment American abundance met Axis ideology and revealed the latter as hollow propaganda, a fantasy constructed to mask inadequacy. Victory came not from superior virtue or divine favor, but from feeding workers, respecting freedom and building systems that unleashed rather than constrained human potential. It was a lesson written in steel and bread, in chocolate cake and conveyor belts, in the quiet confidence of a nation that had discovered it could wage total war without surrendering the abundance that made life worth living. That was the truth that shattered